Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's Germination Retail Roundtable webinar. My name is Mark Zenkowitz, and I serve as editor for Germination. And today I'm happy to be your host. Today's theme is value creation myth busting. We'll talk about value creation, what it is in case you don't already know, and some big myths that are circulating about it. We'll bust right through those myths and in the process give you the knowledge you need to talk to others about this topic in a positive, proactive way. Before we begin, I just want to thank our sponsors, 2020 Seed Labs, Cantera Seeds, and CCAN for their support. We'll also be doing some live tweeting during the proceedings, so feel free to follow us on Twitter by following the hashtag #SeedRetail as we go along. Also, the webinar is being recorded and will be available for viewing via our website within 24 hours. Now, if you were swimming in the ocean and you saw this, you'd probably be pretty frightened, right? I mean, that would be a perfectly normal reaction. And unfortunately, fear is what a lot of farmers seem to be feeling about value creation, judging by recent headlines. I took some screenshots from some various media websites, and this is what I came up with. Seed royalties make farmers nervous. Farmer pushback on seed royalty proposals. Seed royalty irks National Farmers Union. Seed royalty dividing breeders and growers. Cereal seed royalty getting a thumbs down at consultations. Again, if you're swimming in the ocean and you saw this, you'd probably be pretty frightened, but like most things in life, when you go below the surface a little bit and learn more about what it is you're confronted with, you're usually confronted with this and you realize that, oh, that thing I thought was so scary isn't really that scary after all. So this is what we're going to be dealing with today. We welcome any and all questions. If you have a question at any point during the webinar, just type it into the little chat box. You don't have to wait until our speakers are finished. If a question pops into your head, just type it in at any time. Now, I'd like to begin the first of three presentations today. We're going to hear from Carla St. She's the Director, Innovation and Growth Policy for the Strategic Policy Branch at AAFC. And Anthony Parker, Commissioner for the Plant Breeders' Rights Office at CFIA. They're going to talk about the recent value creation consultation sessions that they have hosted, what value creation is, and a couple of the different models for value creation, and also clear up a few of the myths that they've heard about it at the recent consultations. Carla and Anthony, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mark. So I think I'm going to kick things off. It's Carla. And then I'll turn to Anthony about halfway through the presentation. It shouldn't be very long, though. So what I'd like to do is kind of skip this first slide and move right on to the next one, which is really the objective and desired outcomes of the process that we're undertaking right now. So really the fundamental objective is to ensure that profitability and competitiveness of the cereal sector in Canada. And not just the sector, but also producers. So as we're speaking, it'd be great if folks can kind of keep that in mind as we move through the presentation. And so we are, AAFC and the Canadian Food Inspection Agency are consulting right now with stakeholders. And the fundamental reason for that is to ensure that all stakeholders are informed and engaged in the discussion about the future of Canada's cereal sector. And also that folks have an opportunity to share their views on the models that were recommended by the Grains Roundtable, and also to share any alternative approaches that people may have. It's really important to note that no decision has been made at this point on implementing a new model, and also that we are very open to receiving input from all stakeholders along the cereal sector value chain. So one of the myths that Mark had asked me to speak to is kind of on this next slide. So I really wanted to note that we are very much so working with all stakeholders and are very interested in what farmers think on this topic. And again, to reiterate that there have been no decisions made, and we are definitely in consultation mode. And so want to hear the views of all the folks on the webinar and as we've moved across the country. So just to give you a sense of where we've been. So there have been 5 relatively, I would say, more on the formal side of our engagement. We've been in Winnipeg, Ottawa, Saskatoon, Edmonton, and Charlottetown between November and January of 2018-2019. And those were sessions that were hosted by Agriculture and Ag-Food Canada and the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. And they were attended quite well. We had one session that had about 170 people, and overall we had about 500 people that attended those sessions. And then over the last couple of months, probably 2 to 3 months, we have also, Anthony and I, kind of traveled across Canada and attended multiple events that we've been invited to speak about this topic. And so that includes events like CropSphere, Crop Connect, Ag Days, Farm Tech, the Canadian Federation of Agriculture's annual general meeting, and many other meetings, small, medium, and large. And very happy to be here participating on the webinar today. So we're certainly open to hear views and are very much so kind of on information intake mode. So how did we get here? Really, it was a working group that was established under the Grains Roundtable. It was called the Value Creation Working Group. And that Grains Roundtable is a value chain roundtable that is facilitated by Agriculture and Ag-Food Canada, but in essence it comprises, just had a meeting of the Grains Roundtable actually this past Friday, over around 100 members of the grains value chain. And from producer representation all the way through to seed sector. And so it's a large representation of the grain sector. And what they did was tasked a working group to look at this topic. And that working group looked at the topic for a couple of years, and they built on information that had been developed and consultations that had been carried out previous to that. So the topic itself has been discussed by the grain sector in some way, shape, or form for over a decade. But over the past 2 years, that 2016-17 period, there was a value creation working group that in the end landed on 2 models. The one which was the endpoint royalty model, and a second of royalty collection on farm-safe seed, and asked AAFC and CFIA to go out and consult on those 2 models. So that's what we're doing. We're consulting on those 2 models and are very open as government to hearing other options as well. And we want to be sure that everybody kind of has information on this topic. So that's how we got here. What are we doing right now? So there is next steps above and beyond what we've done to what we've heard in those 5 sessions that I just spoke about that we held. There's online consultations that are still very much so planned to occur. And so we're hoping kind of in the spring timeline, so aiming for that March timeline to post material up that everybody can read and have a chance to think about the topic some more, answer some questions. And then we will undertake additional sessions as needed. I expect we'll need more sessions. And then we'll just assess next steps. So no decisions are going to be made in the immediate future. In fact, there is on the forward regulatory plan kind of a timeline of winter 2020, which also is quite flexible. So what is the purpose of value creation? So really, what is it in the end that the Grains Roundtable was hoping to achieve by asking governments to consult on this topic? But really, I would draw your attention back to that kind of first objective on the first slide. So if we move on to kind of the next slide, really the intent of it is to enhance and continue to enhance the sector's competitiveness, producers' competitiveness, profitability, overall of Canada's cereal sector. So the intent is not to force farmers to pay more with no guarantee of any benefit. It really is to look at how do we enhance the sector's competitiveness through any new model. And so if we look at independent studies, and so if we kind of move on to the next couple slides, really any study on the investments into plant breeding have demonstrated returns, and not simply returns to the Canadian economy, but returns to producers. So I'll let you kind of have a look at that slide. And these studies are all kind of found on various websites, and you can have a look at them as well. And I think one of the main takeaways that I have gotten anyway from this process is that producers acknowledge quite readily the benefits of investing in plant breeding. And that really is that investing further into the cereal sector, ultimately, any new model will need to show gains to not only the sector, but also to producers. So our system is fine as it is. We don't need value creation. That kind of is another myth that Mark was asking us to address a little bit. And so I would say our public sector breeding efforts are doing quite well. I think the fundamental question is, do we want to do better? And in order to do better, there is an investment climate that the next slide demonstrates that is a little bit challenged, I would say. So if we look at rates of return and investment incentives, essentially you see the private sector investing quite heavily in crop kinds like canola, corn, and soybeans. And one of the fundamental reasons for that is the system is set up in such a way that there's an ability for that participant to capture a return on their investment. In this case, the private sector. But in other cases as well, in the cereal sector, it's also difficult for the private sector as well as certain public sector participants to be able to capture return on investment. So we show a statistic here on this slide of 14% of overall private sector investment is going into cereals. Just to mention as well, it's the challenge around farm-safe seed usage not only keeps that number low for the private sector investment, but also challenges some public sector and any participants who want to get into plant breeding in that area. And ultimately, the long-term goal is to enhance varieties, and that those varieties enhance choice for producers, and producers in the end, many of which I hope are on the webinar today, will see greater returns for themselves as well. So you see that chart on the right where the farm-safe seed use tends to align fairly clearly with the level of investment. And really the challenge of this conversation is, do we want to find a way to not eliminate the use of farm-safe seed, but to put some conditions on that farm-safe seed use such that there's more balance in the system, and in the end the sector grows and producers' revenue can grow as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to Anthony, and he can maybe pick up from this point.
Thanks very much, Carla. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks so much to Mark and Germination magazine for providing this venue. So one of the myths that has cropped up during our consultation process is the idea that globally the world has enough wheat and cereals in general, and that we don't need to grow anymore. So there's really not going to be any market opportunities. That indeed is not the case. Part of Agriculture and Agri-Foods Canada's medium-term projections going out the next 10 years is wheat exports are going to continue to increase as global population continues to increase. Standards of living across the world, especially in Southeast Asia, continue to rise. There's going to be about a 13% increase in wheat demand. And in general, it's going to be those wheat exporters, Canada included, along with Argentina, Australia, the EU, Kazakhstan, Russia, and Ukraine, who are going to be filling that gap in terms of global export. The real question is, where do we position ourselves as Canada within those countries? And I think it's important to understand that in many of these countries, they already have mechanisms, quite effective mechanisms, for value creation, to ensure high levels of investment in breeding. To give you a sense of that, Australia, about 25 years ago, introduced an endpoint royalty system. It's working quite well and generating high levels of investment. Many of the EU countries, including the United Kingdom, soon to be out of the EU, but also France and Germany and Netherlands, have value creation systems to invest in cereals, varying success depending on the country. We know that Argentina has a system in place, and they're looking at strengthening that system. And I know firsthand from exposure to many countries at the international level, certainly Kazakhstan and Ukraine are both in the process of fact-finding, examining what Canada is discussing right now, but what other countries have implemented to put a value creation system in place. So you can see a trend starting to emerge is other countries are recognizing the importance of investing in cereals to remain competitive, and are looking at different types of models to do that. Lastly, I should note that recently Russia has been strongly trying to encourage higher levels of private sector investment in cereals. So again, a very major exporter of wheat globally. You know, one of the concerns that government has when it sees information associated with the idea that farmers will have fewer choices, in fact, we believe value creation will run exactly in the opposite direction. Farmers are going to have more choices. They're going to have more choices in the sense that public sector programs with royalty revenue can have a greater degree of sustainable funding for their activities, but also hopefully encourage some private sector or public-private partnerships to put down a footprint here in Canada and develop varieties. And having a system that's underpinned by intellectual property protection strongly encourages international breeding companies to try to release their varieties in Canada to see if they're successful. In certain sectors, this is critically important. Many people don't know, but you know, our #1 top growing oat variety in Western Canada, thriving community of small to medium sized cereal breeders. Some are family owned, some are cooperatives. And indeed, we even have here in Canada individual breeders like Jim Dick of Oat Advantage trying to be successful as a small micro private entity in breeding activity. So both of the models that are under discussion are non-exclusionary. They can as equally assist the public sector in increasing sustainable funding, as well as encourage partnerships or private sector to come in as well. Another fundamental principle we have is that there is a strong public sector role. So they continue to remain the prominent actor in cereal breeding, but that a model can also encourage a higher level of private sector investment to drive transformative change. A fundamental principle for government is that producers have choice. None of these models look at forcing producers to adopt new varieties. In fact, both models are predicated on a transition time. So newer varieties would have a royalty associated with them. They would be competing with older varieties in the marketplace that don't have a royalty. The newer varieties better give producers a better value proposition, higher yield, better quality, disease resistant characteristics to make it worth their while to switch to these varieties. So that's really important for us. We understand that this is not a short-term endeavor. If we look at the experience of Australia, it took about a decade for producers to switch over and identify that the newer varieties were that much better and therefore worth paying a royalty associated with them. So that aspect of transition over time is important to us, and we recognize this is not flipping a switch. This is going to take time to be successful, but this is very much a future-looking endeavor. A lot of questions came up through the consultation process that this is something that we've been asked to look at by the Grains Roundtable for cereals, but if there is interest, it could also assist other crops as well. So pulses, flax, really any non-hybrid crop that generally reproduces, self-replicates true to type, and can be farm-safe seed, can be used year after year, could be a candidate for this type of model. So what has changed where we're able to have this conversation now? Well, from the sector, a strong desire that any type of model be underpinned by a piece of federal legislation, and there's a lot of advantages to that. We can ensure that there's transparency and accountability in the system. We can put in requirements for reporting. So in 2015, when we changed the Plant Breeders' Rights Act, we included a provision that in future we could make regulations to put conditions on farm-safe seed. Now, when we're talking about conditions, we're only talking about a royalty. None of these proposals wants to stop a farmer's ability to save and reuse seed. As Carla indicated, it's just about seeking that balance. If you continue to benefit year after year through farm-safe seed, if that innovation is useful to you, if it contributes to your prosperity, is it fair and balanced that you contribute back to the breeding program who has developed that innovation? We also recognize that we put this regulation-making authority in to be forward-looking. As Carla alluded to, the discussion on value creation in Canada has been at least a decade-long discussion. It started in the late 2000s, 2008, 2009, with the Canada Grains Council trying to figure out how do you put a mechanism in place. In 2012 and 2013, the Canadian Seed Trade Association discussed this along with the producer community. Many producer organizations participated in that. And then Western Grains Research Foundation and the provincial commissions discussed models around this type of value creation as well in 2014, 2015. So we were forward looking at the time and said, well, if there's interest within the sector to pursue this model, let's try to find a home for it in a piece of legislation so we can have the accountability, transparency, and oversight mechanisms in place. So we are already seeing some positive impacts around strengthening intellectual property protection and even having the discussion around value creation. We've seen a few large companies put down a footprint here in Canada for breeding. Bayer Crop Science, now BASF, when they've transferred their seed portfolio to that entity, started a breeding program in Pike Lake, Saskatchewan. Many of you are probably aware of the Lima Grain Cantera partnership. Lima Grain is really a leader globally in cereal breeding, in particular wheat. Now they've become interested in Canada. So they've made modest investments, and that's largely attributed to strengthening intellectual property protection, but also having the discussion around value creation moving into the future. If we don't have some sort of mechanism in place to fairly compensate breeders, but also encourage higher levels of investment, it's very doubtful that you'd be able to attract that public sector investment portion. And it's probably going to be continually difficult for public sector breeders without sustainable funding on an ongoing basis to really remain viable. We have seen in other countries, particularly Australia and France, successful models being implemented, and they do drive higher levels of yield and therefore draw higher levels of profitability for producers. So balance is really a key concept here, and I'm going to revisit that in just a few more slides. Actually, it's the next slide. So the take-home message we'd like to communicate from this is, when you find a system that is successful in achieving balance between producers and breeders, both parties do well. And I'll draw your attention. This graph was in a publication from Dr. Richard Gray's, one of Dr. Richard Gray's master's students. And Dr. Richard Gray, if you might know, has been studying this issue of value creation for quite some time. But in places like the United Kingdom, when most of the benefits go to the breeders, it's not really driving the higher level of investments that you're looking for. But in places like France or Australia, where you have that very nicely even distribution of benefits between breeders and farmers, it tends to maximize the outcome for both parties. So you'll see from this graph, and just to explain it in a little bit more detail, in both those countries, on an annual basis, their systems of value creation drive up about an additional $6 per ton in benefits that are shared pretty much equally between farmers and breeders. So we've seen in those countries genetic gain start to increase year after year. So it provides us some insight into what perhaps a clearly beneficial model will look like moving into the future. So finally, I just want to finish off with a few key takeaway messages. When we look at other countries and what would be successful to have a thriving cereal breeding community in Canada, it seems to be about that $1 to $3 per ton or per acre range that seems to incentivize investment. As I mentioned, we've seen other countries be successful in this range, most notably Australia and France. At current, we do have a funding gap challenge where royalty revenue that's only on certified seed generates about 10 to 20% of the costs associated with developing a new variety. And what that means is it's difficult to incentivize private sector to come in and make investments. But it also means in our public sector that in order to sustain those breeding programs, it's highly subsidized by the taxpayer, and thankfully also by producer commissions contributing with levies. The regulation making authority, as Carla has indicated, the government's made no decisions at this point in time. But what I can assure you is that the regulation making authority to accommodate a model, it could be farm safe seed, it could be endpoint royalty, it could be something, an iteration of either one, is very flexible. There's a high degree of flexibility to accommodate a model that would work best. And if we are successful in getting a system in place based on what we've seen in other countries, we can see significant benefits that are shared between breeders and producers. Things like improvements in the rate of genetic gain for yield growth, higher investment in yield stability, which is becoming really important as we deal with climate change and the emergence of new pests and disease pressures. Also, hopefully, some investment in end user functionality. And at the end of the day, none of these models work unless there's increased producer profitability. So as Carla indicated, we're only in the first steps of the consultative process, and we're seeking further advice on what our next steps would be. Now, finally, I do have a series of annexes. They're really used here as a tool to help producers in the sector as a whole understand some of the details of these proposed models. So they're really here to serve as a reference for you, but I'm not going to go into very much detail. As I'm flipping through some slides, the one thing I can say is that because we're not forerunners in this area, France and Australia went through this about 20-25 years ago. There's lots of important lessons that we can learn about how their systems work and how successful or not successful they have been. So with that, I think I'm just going to queue it up for the next speaker and then turn it over.
Great.
Okay, thanks. Thanks so much for your attention, everyone.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Anthony, for your time today, and Carla as well. We will take questions from our audience now. If you have a question, again, please just type it into the chat box. Anthony and Carla, can you comment on the two models being proposed under this plan? There's the endpoint royalty model and the trailing royalty model. At your recent consultations, has one model been received more favorably than another?
It's Carla. Maybe I'll take that question and Anthony can follow up as need be. I would say that we've heard a diversity of views. At certain sessions, there may be, a preference for, say, the trailing royalty, and at others, there may be kind of indication that there's simplicity with the endpoint royalty mechanism. And then in other sessions, there's some questions around whether we need a model or not. So really not anything absolutely definitive in one, swaying in one direction or another. And in fact, there is some conversation around a third model, which is in essence a variation, I would say, more so along the endpoint royalty system, but not anything definitive one way or the other, but definitely a diversity of views. And people are engaging, which is excellent.
In terms of the general response to the proposed models, in your view, Anthony and Carla, is there enough industry consensus at this point to implement one of these value creation models? What are you looking for from industry?
Sure, maybe I'll start off with that, and Carla can chime in with her thoughts. I think it's what we're discussing here is a fairly significant change. And I think stakeholders, the producer community, the sector as a whole needs some time to get its head around the options and discuss them. And I think if I reflect on what happened through our consultations, I think, and as you articulated at the beginning of the presentation, it's a natural reaction to be have an aversion to change. You can be fearful of it. You can question why it's needed. But I think as we've had more and more discussion around some of the details, and this is something Carla indicated earlier, producers really do want to invest in varietal development. They see value in it. The question is more how and what is the appropriate mechanism. So I think in terms of my advice is we've heard pretty clearly that the producer community and the sector as a whole wants to continue the conversation, and we're very willing to do that. And I think as that conversation continues, I remain very optimistic that more detail and more consensus is going to arrive around what the model should look like.
As a supplier of seed, this is a question we just received. As a supplier of seed, my biggest concern is the extra time it takes to input data after a sale. I'm assuming this person is commenting on possible extra paperwork they might have to do if one of these value creation models is implemented. Carla and Anthony, could one or both of you comment a little bit about that concern?
I mean, I can talk kind of globally about that. Certainly, we want to avoid unnecessary kind of hurdles for folks. So administratively speaking, any new model would not only need to look at kind of efficiencies from a paperwork perspective and that sort of thing. So we wouldn't want to see the sector at large and this particular individual as well unnecessarily burdened with paperwork. But also cost-wise, we'd want to see administrative costs low. And there are lots of new ways of doing things. We do have new technologies like blockchain and that sort of thing that I know certain parts of the sector are exploring. And so I'm confident that if we get to that point where we're thinking about the mechanics of it, that we can find a system that's efficient and not only administratively in terms from a paperwork perspective, but also financially efficient.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Carla and Anthony, for the great presentation. We're just going to switch over to our second speaker now. Lorne Hadley is Executive Director for the Canadian Plant Technology Agency. And Lorne is going to talk a little bit about one of the models, which is the seed variety use agreement, or the trailing royalty model. This is something Lorne has been dealing with for quite a while now in his work, and he is our resident expert on that topic. So take it away, Lorne. Sorry, Lorne, I muted your mic for you. You might have to turn it back on again. My apologies.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for the introduction, Mark, and thanks to Anthony and Carla for their continued diligence and presence in this conversation. I'm here representing the seed industry, and as you can imagine, this is a key conversation for all of the players in the seed industry. We have been in this discussion for 10 plus years, many of us for longer. What we felt would be valuable is for, as a seed industry, to state our opinion of what model would work and why. So we've actually developed a proposal that we're presenting as part of this discussion called the Seed Variety Use Agreement. And it's developed around those three principles you see: value, transparency, and choice. As seed developers, seed sellers, and seed growers, we know farmers buy things when they see a value in what they buy. So any new variety is going to have a value to the producer, a value in cultivation. We think that this needs to be a very transparent system, and people need to know what they're committing to when they buy a variety of a particular type. And we believe in choice. And I will just mention that even though there are many varieties with varying levels of intellectual property protection, there is lots of choice on the market today, and we expect that to continue. One of the things that our breeders and seed companies tell us is the speed of variety development has changed. It is now quicker than it has been in the past, and it's the new technology that farmers have seen, things like auto steer and yield mapping, and all of those electronic things that are done have also created a great deal of efficiency in plant breeding. Without even looking at genetic changes and changes to genetic technology, there's been a huge increase. But they're costly. Our last estimate, which is several years old, said that a new variety of self-pollinated crop in Canada takes somewhere between 8 and 12 years to develop, and on a cost accounting basis costs about $1 million to bring to market. And that number is pretty similar whether you're public or private, but certainly this is an expensive thing. We, as the seed industry, talk to our counterparts and competitors worldwide, and we can tell you without any doubt that there is a tremendous amount of money flowing into plant breeding worldwide right now, just based on the new technology and the new availability. So we have a made in Canada solution. We've looked at all the models that are around the world, studied this actually for longer than a decade. The first international study done by the Canadian Seed Trade Association was actually in 2007. We've proposed what is a seed variety use agreement, where the farmer would sign an electronic contract on a variety basis, and that would tell him that he is prepared to pay a fee for using the variety when he is growing seed that he's grown himself. This would only actually apply to those varieties that have got plant breeders' rights after February of 2015, and it preserves the choice of farmers that want to use their own produced seed on their own farm. Plant breeders aren't going to be forced to be in part of this platform or this system, and it's up to them to decide whether they want to be part of it. They will, however, have to live up to some transparency issues, and one of those is they will have to name their price of farm-saved seed use prior to sale of certified seed of that variety. We expect that farmers will buy a variety of certified seed with an SVU fee based on their value at cultivation. Really simply, as the seed industry, we have a lot of experience in this area. As many of you know, we run an electronic platform for contracting, sometimes called on a stewardship basis for midge-tolerant wheat. This graphic just lays out what happens in this system. Again, it's as electronic as possible, as light at touch as possible, enabled by computer, cell phone, tablet. Really, basically, the producer makes the choices. The platform communicates with him as to what he owes, etc. So one of the things that's been talked about here is this is not about creating value. And just to be clear, the seed industry's role in the long term has always been bringing improved varieties to producers in a way that those varieties create value on the producer's farm. And it doesn't matter what we bring out, the goal is to bring something to a producer that he will use because he sees value in it. One of the myths you'll see is that there's no need to change funding for plant breeding. From the standpoint of the seed industry, one of our challenges, we're concerned about the number of people breeding. We're concerned about the fact that there is no mid or small level breeders in Canada because they simply can't compete. So you have public breeding and you have large breeding, and you don't have anything in between. We know that there's new genetics and new opportunities coming, and we'd like those to be accessed. And we know from other countries that some of those things are coming from the smaller to medium to micro-sized breeding institutions. What this system does in reality is it allows a continued opportunity for producers who wish to divert some of their own grain production for seed use. So no variety that was on the market prior or was registered prior to February of 2015 will ever have an SVUA fee on it. They will always have a farmer's privilege. That's the way they entered the market. That's the way it stays. Most of the current varieties will not have a fee as well. We as the seed industry can't make a commitment because the commercial decision of a breeder as to whether or not something has a high enough value to attract a fee is what brings them into the system. Again, as I'd mentioned before, one of the things that we notice around the world is that Canada is kind of unique in that we have very few small to medium-sized breeding institutions. We have large institutions. We don't have a lot of small ones. We've mentioned a gentleman by the name of Jim Dick who runs a company called Oat Advantage, who is a family breeding company. There are many of those kinds of institutions in self-pollinated crops in other areas of the world. There's virtually none in Canada. And part of it is because the prime way that those institutions get funded is through the sales of certified seed. And in Canada, the sales of certified seed represent somewhere between 15 to 30% of the acres of any crop. And it's just simply not large enough for them to be able to support themselves. However, all breeders have a common goal. Breeders are just really highly technical farmers. They're looking to create, to recombine, develop varieties that bring benefits to the producer. They're looking for something better. They're looking for advantages in yield and disease resistance and agronomics and standability. They get a kick out of bringing new things in. So to finish up, these are the three principles the seed industry came up with. We believe our preferred model meets those needs. We're pleased to engage and be part of the discussion. We think it's valuable that all the voices be heard and that all the questions be answered. Without any further ado, I'll turn it back to you for any questions that might be here.
Thanks so much, Lorne. I have a question. You used, sorry, I'm just going to mute your mic again for a moment. You might have to turn it back on in a sec. You used a phrase earlier. You talked about grain diverted for seed use. Can you explain that and how that's different from the concept of farm-saved seed?
Well, essentially, it's the same thing. One of the challenges we have in the seed industry is if you're a pedigreed seed producer, there is a set of requirements to produce good quality seed. Those include field use history, those include sanitation and the cleaning of equipment, right from the time you start working in a pedigreed seed field till you finish harvesting and put the seed away in a bin. And all of those requirements are put in place with a combination of regulation and good practices. And essentially, farm-safe seed, as we look at it, is a farmer taking some grain that he's produced using the standard grain production practices and simply looking at it, doing some tests, and it's, quotes, good enough for use for seed. So it's not commercial seed in a commercial sense. It's something that a producer produced on his own farm for his own use and doesn't really meet with the requirements that are laid out for the production of seed in the pedigreed seed industry.
With regards to certified seed use under this proposal, are farmers essentially paying twice for their seed? Is this sort of a form of double dipping? Can you clarify that?
So under the seed variety use agreement, a farmer buys his pedigreed seed and pays for that. There's no additional fee on that first crop, on that first growing season. The additional fee comes into place in subsequent growing seasons. So in terms of a producer who presently buys 100% pedigreed seed, the SVUA has no impact on him. It has no impact on the commercial transactions that have been taking place at this time. All the impact is the contract will trigger some commitments in the next growing season.
Lauren, the process of collecting and monitoring trailing royalty fees and acres, how would that potentially look?
So the system as we've proposed it is that a farmer will buy pedigreed seed. He will be presented with a contract. I'm just going to go back to the flow chart. He will divert some of the grain that he's grown from that first crop for use as seed. Based on the contact information we have in the electronic contract, he'll be contacted and asked to tell us, did you use some for seed and how much? The concept at this time is that all those organizations that are using the SVUA will use the same platform. And so we will collect all that information together, and then the farmer would get a single invoice for all varieties where he is committed to pay an SVUA fee. In terms of enforcement, CPTA has 2 decades of experience in enforcing plant breeders' rights. We would use the same system we use. We call it coaching for compliance. The first thing we know is, as Canadian farmers, they're very respectful of the law if you explain it to them. So we will take every opportunity to explain the obligations and to work forward with producers so they understand the obligations they've made under the contract. In any case where there is a problem, where things aren't working, then this relies on contract law, the same as any other intellectual property tool. So it will be a dispute between the farmer who signed the contract and the company or companies who didn't receive the payment as promised under the contract.
Well, I have a similar concern as expressed earlier during our first presentation with regards to the extra cost and potential liability of seed sellers having to ensure all documents are signed on a sale. Do you have any comments in regard to that?
Well, I think that first of all is the extra cost is going to be minimized as best we can by using best technology. We've moved, as I said, to the midge tolerant program, midge tolerant wheat, to an electronic contract. In terms of liability to the retailer, the liability of the retailer would not be significantly different than it is today. This contract is a condition of sale, and as a distributor of a variety, you're expected to communicate and adhere and confirm the conditions of sale with the buyer. So long as the seed retailer has done that, then the liability is not on the seed retailer. But they have to have taken the steps to inform and contract and understand these are seed companies and seed growers that are proposing this. So we clearly understand the frontline problem of what happens, and we'll do our best to communicate and make the process as simple as possible.
Well, thank you so much for your time today, Lorne. That was a terrific presentation. We're just going to move on to our third and final presentation of the day. Thank you so much for spending your lunch hour with us today. We're going to have a short informal chat with Ward Oatway. He is until recently, was the president of the Alberta Seed Growers. He just passed on the torch last month. Ward has been growing seeds since 1984. He farms with his wife Lori and daughters Ezra and Bree, along with his parents on the family farm south of Clive, Alberta. Can you hear me, Ward?
Yes, I can.
Perfect. So what I'm going to do is pose a few common questions that Ward gets as a seed grower in regard to value creation. Ward is a supporter of value creation. You may have read some recent interviews we did with him in Germination magazine. The first question is, as a seed grower, Ward, why do you support something that a lot of farmers seem to be against, judging by recent headlines, of course?
Yeah, well, I guess my outlook on it is that any system that needs to advance needs to be supported, and the way I look at it is with the plant breeders and everything, the programs don't seem to be getting more money. They keep saying that they're keeping it the same. You can look in the news and see closures of sites, or them going out of certain crops that aren't necessarily the high-paying ones like flax, etc. And I just see that, I guess from my standpoint, is that if we're not supporting this, and we're going to lose these. And they're doing a fine job with what they've got right now, but they could be doing, I think, a lot better with more support.
Or did you support the idea of value creation from the very beginning? Can you trace that journey for us in terms of your own personal thought process?
I guess I was a little skeptical on how it was going to work. I know, the systems themselves. I mean, I'm not sure that I have a super favorite amongst either one of them. I can see the ease of use of an endpoint royalty as opposed to SVUA, but we're sort of in a unique situation across the prairies here that the endpoint is so varied. I mean, you don't know where that's going. It could be crossing the line into the States, or it could be going to a feedlot, or you don't know. I think there'd be quite a bit of slippage there, and I echo the concerns of people on this, that the SVUA sounds good and everything, but if it makes me have to do a whole bunch more work, then I'm not in favor of that. I don't know how many on there are like me, where I'm a one-man band. I have a hard enough time keeping up with my own accounting, let alone having to add to it. So that part is and was concerning to me. I think I'm in favor of the idea that we need to be, pulling this wagon rather than pushing it, and getting people on board with this and adding that value so that they can breed more varieties here, whether it be private or public.
Again, just a reminder to our audience, if you have a question for Ward, please just type it into our chat box. Ward, are you concerned about a farmer's right to save seed being taken away? This has become a big concern. What are your thoughts on that?
No, I don't think so. I mean, there's always going to be, the ability to do that and save your own if you find that yours is of a quality you're comfortable with, then definitely it's up to you to use, and especially if you've got a variety that you really like that's not covered under this, so then you have that ability to do that. And there's lots of people that are comfortable with an older variety, and that's what they want to use, and that's what they keep using, and you can't fault them for that. I mean, it's what you're used to and what you're comfortable with.
How about you yourself? This has been another concern expressed, is that under value creation, older varieties will no longer be available, that seed growers are just going to grow new varieties so that they can charge more for seed and this sort of thing. As a seed grower yourself, do you plan to keep growing older varieties for seed on your farm?
Well, absolutely. I mean, with me, I know that I've got peat barley varieties that work really well in this area and are suited to here, and that they're getting upwards of 15 years old, and I still have customers that swear by them and want to use them. And as long as I've still got demand for those varieties, of course, I'm still going to use it. If something comes along that is a larger increase on what I'm using, I will likely try it, but and maybe try and push customers into looking at this new variety or whatever. But as long as I've got customers for the ones that I have no intention of switching over.
Thank you so much, Ward. I'm just going to keep you online or on hold for a moment. Don't go anywhere. I have one more question for Lorne Hadley, actually. Lorne, I have a question about the seed variety use agreement. Would this be an evergreen agreement similar to the Midge stewardship agreement that's currently in place for wheat?
The way that we work would be very similar to Midge tolerant. There would be an evergreen agreement that the farm signs, and then at time of invoicing, each variety would be assigned to it with its particular conditions and particular strategy. So yes, it would be an electronic agreement similar to the agreement that's now signed with the Midge tolerance, and then as a producer buys varieties that are subject to an SVUA, those conditions would be assigned to the evergreen contract.
Yes, actually, I have a comment from Brenda Trask at CCAN mentioning that this would be an evergreen agreement. It would be the seed seller's responsibility to get the farmer to sign the seed variety use agreement for that particular variety. At the time, the farmer would also indicate who would verify the acres planted with Farm Safe seed, and then would be invoiced based on those acres in the next year. Well, I'd like to thank everybody for joining our webinar today. That's about an hour. This has been a great webinar. Thank you so much for your time today. Hope you found the information of value. Just want to thank our sponsors one more time, 2020 Seed Labs, Cantera Seeds, and CCAN for their support. I'd also quickly like to thank our technical assistants, Teresa Kurdziewicz and Kyle Dradawani, who've been working very hard behind the scenes to make this a successful event. Again, this webinar will be available on our website, germination.ca. And for more information on this topic, visit seedvaluecreation.ca. Thank you so much for your time today, everyone, and have a terrific day.